Hello marketing research students, Dr. Z here. I want to provide you with a brief overview of Chapter 9. In this chapter we will contrast qualitative and quantitative data analyses. We'll explain the steps in qualitative data analysis. We'll describe processes of categorizing and coding data and developing theory. We'll clarify how credibility is established in qualitative data analysis. And finally, we'll discuss the steps involved in writing a qualitative research report. Qualitative research is useful in providing knowledge for decision makers, and as I've mentioned in class, it provides for researchers to get rich data that goes beyond yes, no, and statistical type of information. It attempts to get to the why behind different research questions. When the purpose of research project is to better understand psychoanalytical or cultural phenomenon, then qualitative data is a good choice. Can you think of an example in which the research purpose is to gain better understanding? Well, a couple of your group research projects would fit that category. How about understanding why HU grads choose to live in Huntington County? Or how about trying to better understand why some college athletes devote more time to their sport than to academics? On this chart, we will compare qualitative data with quantitative data. Qualitative data tends to be textual or visual. It can be observation, it could be long answers to open-ended questions, or it could come from interviews. The goal is to understand, to provide better understanding. Qualitative data, as you review it and analyze it, you interpret and you obtain new meaning, so it's iterative. It employs member checking. Member checking is where you actually have the participants review their transcripts or review the data to make sure that it is correct. It's inductive in nature. Quantitative data tends to be numerical, statistic, yes, no. The goal is to quantify or measure the magnitude of variables, the intensity, and relationships. It's guided entirely by the researchers. Qualitative data analysis is largely inductive. The categories, themes, and patterns analysts describe in their reports emerge from the data rather than being defined prior to data collection, as in quantitative analysis. Some researchers criticize qualitative research as soft, lacking rigor, being inferior, but measurement and statistical analysis do not ensure that research is useful or accurate. What increases the likelihood of good research is a deliberate, thoughtful, knowledgeable approach, whether qualitative or quantitative research methods are used. Member checking is used with qualitative research, and that's where you ask your key informants or participants to read the researcher's report to verify that the analysis is accurate. In my doctoral research, I actually had participants read their interview transcripts, and they were able to make corrections or clarifications when things were not stated the way that they intended. At this time, please pause this PowerPoint and go into Moodle to view Introduction to Qualitative Data Analysis video that's posted there. So typically with qualitative data analysis, researchers engage in a three-step process: data reduction, data display, and then conclusion drawing and verification. Now pause the PowerPoint and watch this second video, which is posted in Moodle, Beginner's Guide to Qualitative Data Analysis. I hope those videos were helpful. I looked at a lot of different videos on data analysis for qualitative data, and those two were pretty simplistic, but I thought they were pretty easy to understand and pretty thorough. So I hope that was helpful. So in analyzing qualitative data, it's interactive. We collect the data from our surveys, interviews, or focus groups. We then reduce that to codes, and codes are like key phrases, key themes, key words. We then categorize it and display that data to draw conclusions from it. So basically the conclusions come from the original data through the process of data reduction and data display. The process of qualitative data reduction can get kind of confusing, so I would just advise read the chapter carefully. Also, there are a lot of different videos, supplemental videos on YouTube that you can look to get clarification. But then thirdly, I would say don't make it any harder than it needs to be. There are two basic steps with data reduction: coding and categorization. And coding basically is where you take phrases or sentences or ideas and you categorize them by theme. So one of the things I would recommend doing if you have qualitative questions in your surveys is question by question, look at the data for the question, break it out into similar thematic answers, and then analyze those different themes that occur, the different answer categories that occur across that question. Data reduction consists of many interrelated processes, and they're listed here, and we will go through those in more detail here in a minute. If you were dealing with hundreds of surveys or hundreds of interviews, you would want to develop codes, numeric codes for each different thematic answer that occurs. Because our survey sample sizes will be smaller, you probably don't need to develop codes. I would just code by word or theme, and then categorization is placing those themes that are consistent together and breaking them into different categories. Comparison is basically comparing the different answers that you get and the different themes that result from your data. And then integration is where, as you're looking at the different themes and categories, you develop a theory that again relates to your primary research question. In recursive relationships, variables may cause and be caused by the same variable. A good example is the relationship between job satisfaction and financial compensation. Job satisfaction tends to increase performance and thus compensation earned on the job, which in turn increases job satisfaction. Selective coding is where there is one theme that sticks out and you build your research results around that one theme. Iteration means going through the data several different times, maybe by different group members, to see if you're interpreting things the same way or if you have new interpretations that result by going through the data. Memoing is writing down your thoughts. After interviews or focus groups, you won't do that so much with surveys. And then negative case analysis, looking for cases and instances that contradict the ideas and theories researchers have been developing. Did you get some surprises in your research data that you weren't expecting? Step 2 is data display. Some common types of displays are tables, diagrams, and matrices. And I would just say this: when you're doing your final report, any data that makes more sense in a table or diagram or matrix, sometimes it's easier to convey meaning that way than it is with words. So when you can use visuals, and the visuals are clear and are a better way to explain your data, by all means use visuals. Step 3 is conclusion drawing and verification. Qualitative research, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it gets a bad rap because some researchers don't see it as rigorous as quantitative research. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Emic validity. If key members of your population agree with the findings in the research, that's a step of validation. It's known as emic validity. Cross-researcher reliability, and that's when different researchers from different studies or different researchers in your group come to the same coding decisions and the same conclusions that you did. Credibility is also important, and credibility How careful were you with following your methodology, guarding the data, asking good questions, and then with your analysis? Triangulation is a great way to build credibility, and that's when multiple perspectives verify the analysis that you came to. Now, I don't know that we're going to have the luxury of that with our studies, but for instance, in my doctoral study, my results from my interviews were triangulated with the literature review, and were also triangulated with other research studies that had been done. If we were doing an academic study, the ultimate validity measure is peer review, and that's where other researchers verify or confirm the validity of your research process. We are not doing that for this class. Not going to spend a lot of time here. This is in your textbook, but these are just some things that sometimes threaten credible research and credible qualitative analysis. So make sure you review those and don't fall prey to those. Qualitative research report has 3 sections. First is your introduction, and in your introduction you would list or state your research objectives, your primary research question, description of your research methodology and research design. And then section 2 would be the analysis of your data or findings, which would include things that you found from your lit review. Also data displays and your interpretation and summary of your research data findings. Lastly would be your conclusions and recommendations section. Recommendations, you would only have those if you're doing research for a client or if your project lends itself to making recommendations. So for our groups, probably the admissions group and the score group are probably the only 2 that would have a recommendation section. The methodology section of your report, these things, also number of researchers, that would be the number of people in your group, and then how you chose your informants. That's basically your sampling selection method. You will want to include a number of participants that were in your study. You could also do a response rate, how many people you emailed or how many people you sent surveys to and how many responded. I don't think we're going to have focus groups. If you had interviews, you would include the transcripts. You would also include a copy of your survey instrument or questionnaire as part of your research report. Every study has limitations, so some common examples of limitations were, you had limited time, money, you could only send surveys to a certain number of people. Those would all be examples of limitation. This slide gives you some tips for your data finding section. Logical, you would want to have support for statements that you make. You can include quotes, but if you do include verbatims or quotes, make sure your participants remain anonymous. The way you label them is like participant 1, participant 2, but you don't use their names to protect their anonymity. This last slide just contains some examples of recommendations that you might make if your research client or your research purpose lends itself to making recommendations. This is just an example of possible recommendations, examples of recommendations that you could make. So I hope this was helpful. Again, read the chapter carefully. Don't hesitate to supplement the reading with videos from YouTube, and I'll be available in our classroom Zoom classes to answer questions that you may have. Take care.